Hey guys, Pastor Mike here. Thank you for joining me. My wife and I, we were driving down the road. We passed by the local Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall, and I figured, it might be good to talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses. They are the most populous cult, the most visible cult in really our area, and it might be good to just look at what they believe, so that we're better prepared to reach them, to preach the gospel to them. 1 Peter 3:15 says that we need to always be ready. We honor Christ the Lord as holy by being ready to give an answer for anyone who would ask us for the reason why we have hope, and to do this with gentleness and respect. And so being capable of dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, of talking with them, of sharing the gospel with them is very important. You could always be ready by having a really good handle on the Bible and what the Bible teaches, but it is also very helpful to know a little something about what they believe. And then additionally, looking at the Jehovah's Witnesses and comparing what they teach to the scriptures is a good exercise for us. You remember the author of Hebrews said that the mature person is the one who has the powers of their discernment trained with constant practice. They're the ones who eat the solid food, whereas the people who have no discernment are the ones the author of Hebrews says are still drinking milk. And so we want to eat solid food. And so looking at the Jehovah's Witnesses will be a good means of discernment for us. A light looks brightest when it's surrounded by darkness. And so let's look at the teachings and history of the Jehovah's Witnesses as a means for the truth of God to shine forth. All right. So in this video, I want to talk about some of the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then in future videos we'll go and look at what they believe and what they teach and ways that we can effectively minister the gospel to them. And so let's think about the history here. Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Watchtower Bible Tract Society as the organization is called today, was started by a man named Charles Taze Russell. Russell, as a young man, attended Presbyterian and Congregational churches, and he rejected them. He hated the doctrine of hell, that hell is eternal conscious torment. He felt that some parts of the Christian faith were very unreasonable, and so he became a skeptic. Right around that time, there was an incredible movement happening in our nation. What is called Adventism or Millerism, the Millerite movement. There was a man by the name of William Miller. Miller was something of a lay Baptist pastor. And Miller, unfortunately, had gotten into the practice of date setting. So he actually had come up with a date when Jesus was going to come back. And I think this was around the year 1844. And Miller's prediction really caught on in American society. It was almost an eschatological fever. Like, people were really psyched about the coming of Christ in 1844. If you don't know that term, eschatology, it is from the Greek word eschatos, meaning end or last. And so eschatology is your theology of the last things, the end, the coming of Christ, and the judgment, and so forth. Well, what ends up happening is, of course, Jesus doesn't come back when Miller predicted. Interestingly, Miller went on to repent and apologize for his prediction, and to live, I think, the rest of his life as a faithful Christian. But the damage had been done. And many people were just devastated by the fact that Jesus hadn't come back at that time. In fact, historians call that era the Great Disappointment, because there were so many people distraught and disappointed that Jesus hadn't come back. Well, there was a group among that movement which said actually Miller's prediction was right. They said the thing that Miller got wrong was it wasn't a physical coming of Christ, it was a spiritual coming of Christ. These people are known as Adventists, and they still exist today. There are Advent Christians all over the world, really. In fact, there's an Advent church here in Torrington. There are other forms of Adventism. Seventh-day Adventism is another very popular form of Adventism. To be honest with you, I think it stands outside the pale of the classic Christian faith, because within Adventism, there's a rejection of some really important teachings, like hell. Adventists reject the notion that hell is eternal conscious torment. As frightful as it is to talk about hell, the Bible does teach that it is forever, and that it goes on and on and on, and that God's judgment will be poured out in that. Well, Adventists reject that. They reject the notion that man has an immaterial human soul. so that you and I aren't just meat all the way down, as it were, but that we have a body and soul, so that we are a psychosomatic unity, a body-soul or body-spirit unity. They reject those teachings, and they have a real emphasis on some pretty strange end times predictions. All right, I say strange because they're out of step with traditional biblical Christians. Well, Adventism began to gain in popularity, and right around that time, Charles Taze Russell had watched the Millerite thing come and go, and he sort of got involved and found himself very attracted to some of the teaching of Adventism. It seemed to him to be a much more reasonable form of Christianity. And so he ended up beginning a magazine that he published with an Adventist teacher by the name of N.H. Barber. It's important to note that Charles Taze Russell was originally, and he was a newspaperman. He had written editorials in the newspaper. He had published different things. He was also on, in terms of the production side and the manufacturing of newspapers, he was skilled with that as well. And so when it came time for him to publish his own magazine, he was fully capable of doing that, and he was actually quite good at the production of literature. Eventually, Charles Taze Russell rejected some of the teaching of Adventism and sort of went his own way. And that own way is kind of what we know today as the Jehovah's Witnesses. Although, certainly some of the things that Charles Taze Russell taught and believed then, Jehovah's Witnesses do not teach and believe now, which is something of an inconvenient truth when you think about what Jehovah's Witnesses say about their doctrine. Well, Charles Taze Russell was a really interesting guy. He's probably a very bright man, obviously a very charismatic teacher and speaker. But in terms of his theology, so just talking about how he viewed God and the Bible and Christian doctrine, he had some very dangerous and incorrect teaching. He rejected things like the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of substitutionary atonement, that Jesus died for sinners and paid for their sin. He rejected the doctrine of eternal conscious torment, hell, the doctrine of the soul. He rejected a wide variety of Christian belief in favor of a form of Christianity that seemed to him to be much more reasonable and rational. And you can kind of, if you know anything about history and the fact that there was the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, you can kind of see where Russell was coming from intellectually. There was a high priority placed on human reason in America during that time. Human ingenuity. It was right around that time where you sort of had the age of industry, and so there was an optimism about what humans were capable of, intellectually. And I think Russell was influenced by that and sort of recast Christianity in his own image, really, recasting it in terms of what he thought was more reasonable and legit. Russell went on to produce much literature, garnering a following. He went and started Bible studies and actually created quite a following of people who called him affectionately Pastor Russell. One of his stock in trade was to criticize other Christian groups, especially Catholics and Protestants. His not predecessor, but the one who came after him, Judge Rutherford, was a little bit more vitriolic and sort of mean to Catholics and Protestants. But Russell's sort of stock in trade was, let me bash the teaching of the Protestants, right? And Protestants kind of took notice of this. They also noticed some of the teachings that Russell had, and they knew that what he was teaching was dangerous. One minister in particular, a Baptist minister by the name of Pastor Ross out in Canada, actually wrote a little tract to rebuke some of the teachings of Russell and to sort of divulge the fact that Russell was not someone you would want to trust. All right, if you had a big piggy bank in your house, you wouldn't want him to watch it. In other words, right? Because it might not be there when you got back. Well, this tract, which was called, if I can remember correctly, Some Facts About the Self-Styled Pastor Charles Taze Russell. And what ended up happening was Russell had a habit of suing people. He was very litigious. If you said anything against him or against his livelihood, he would sue you. It's just kind of the way he ran. And so what did he do? He sues Pastor Ross for libel, saying that he was engaging in libel in his tract, which made something of an interesting situation for Russell in the court. So Russell goes to court, and what he has to do in order to prove that Pastor Ross was committing libel is he has to disprove what Ross said. One of the things that Ross said was, this guy doesn't have any training theologically. That's why he makes so many crazy assertions. I say crazy because Russell had some pretty off-the-wall predictions about things. He was predicting the coming of Christ in 1914. He was predicting all manner of just very bizarre teachings. And not only predictions, but just doctrines that were very strange. And so Russell, what he has to do is to disprove Ross's assertions. He has to demonstrate to the court that, in fact, he's a well-trained theologian, that he knows the Bible front and back, and that he is capable. Russell routinely claimed and promoted his expertise in the Greek New Testament. And so one of the things, and this is actually outlined in a wonderful book, I have it right here. This is The Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin. If you want to know about counter-cult apologetics, if you want to know about the Jehovah's Witnesses or Christian Science or, Seventh-day Adventism or Islam, Unitarian Universalism, this is a good book to get your start on. Some really good stuff in here. But Walter Martin, the late Christian apologist, Dr. Walter Martin has gone on to his reward in heaven at this point. But Walter Martin has a section in his book, The Kingdom of Cults, where he transcribes what went on in this courtroom. And what the short of it is, the lawyer says to Charles Taze Russell, who has taken the stand, do you know the Greek of the New Testament? And Russell responds saying, oh, yes, of course I do, right? And so the lawyer says, okay, here's the Greek alphabet. Name the letters for us. And Russell isn't able to do it. And he sort of hems and haws. And the lawyer's like, well, do you know this? And he goes, well, I have my own way of doing it, which is kind of strange, right? Because anybody who's taken any Greek knows the alphabet. I mean, all you have to do is join a fraternity, right? And you know the Greek alphabet. It's sort of standard if you're going to know anything about a language to know its alphabet, right? And Charles Taze Russell is not able to recite even one letter of the alphabet, right? Which is kind of sad because some of the letters look a lot like English letters, right? So he just had no training at all. And throughout that trial, he was shown to kind of be a fraud. And later on, Pastor Ross would produce a second edition of his tract called Some More Facts and Some Facts about the self-styled Pastor Russell. And Russell was just known for a lot of sort of chicanery, a lot of interesting behavior. He had garnered a lot of wealth through a lot of cheap tricks, shall we call them. One of which is kind of interesting. He had been selling so-called miracle wheat from his church, from his tabernacle. Actually, from the pulpit, he would sell miracle wheat, what he called miracle wheat. This was basically wheat seed that he would sell for about 100 times what the typical wheat seed would cost. And there was a newspaper in Brooklyn, a newspaper that no longer exists. It's called the Brooklyn Eagle, that really sort of was irritated with Charles Taze Russell, looked at his behavior and kind of saw right through it. And so what they did was they purchased some of this wheat seed from Russell, this miracle wheat seed, and they sent it off to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and had it evaluated and analyzed. And the USDA came back saying this is not only not miracle wheat seed, it's actually low-quality wheat seed. It wouldn't even produce the kind of crop that your typical wheat seed at the store would produce. It's actually worse off. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of the flavor of the kind of guy Charles Taze Russell is. He was obviously a very brilliant man, but in terms of his dealings with people, definitely some questionable behaviors there. And theologically, Russell definitely was sort of self-made. He sort of came up with his own ideas about things, things that seem reasonable to him and put those into play. And unfortunately, many people followed him and believed him, right? And this is sort of what you hear something like this in First Timothy, where Paul warns Timothy saying, listen, there are going to be people who will rise up from within the church and create false doctrines, and people follow after them. In fact, they do it so that people will follow after them. Eventually, Russell gets down to the business of predicting that Jesus will come back in 1914. And before his prediction can come, Russell dies. He dies on a train. He dies a very wealthy man. And he leaves really a publishing, the Jehovah's Witness publishing empire behind. And who takes his spot? None other than a man named Judge Rutherford. Judge was his sort of nickname. Rutherford was Charles Taze Russell's attorney, and evidently not a very good one, right? Because he got him, in that libel case, he didn't do so great. But Rutherford takes over, and as an attorney, he too is very litigious, suing people, getting people ousted, and he sort of boils down the organization of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's the one who actually names the Jehovah's Witnesses. And Russell had some success in the building of his group. I think Rutherford even had some more. He was able to build upon the foundation that Russell left. And Rutherford was something of a controversial leader. He was very forthright, very blunt, and he really did not like Catholics or Protestants. He would rail against Christians all the day long, very vitriolic, very domineering. He was no friend of the federal government either. He had a habit of criticizing the government and criticizing things like the war effort and so forth. What ends up happening is Rutherford is actually arrested and sent to prison because he was basically encouraging people to rip up their draft cards and to subvert the draft. He eventually gets vindicated and brought out of jail. And Russell, whereas Russell would make some predictions and say some things that, didn't come to pass, I think Rutherford sort of brought it to a new level. I'll just give you one example of several one could give. So one of the things Rutherford did was when 1914 came and went, they sort of opted to malign that and change it. Well, we really didn't say he was coming back in 1914, right? They sort of make that again into something of a spiritual coming of Christ. And Rutherford then begins to predict that in 1925, Jesus is coming back. And what he does is he claims that the patriarchs, David, Abraham, the 12 patriarchs, some of the apostles, are going to be resurrected. And so what we need to do, is we need to build a place for them to live, a place suitable for these great men of God. And so Rutherford commissions the Jehovah's Witnesses to build a mansion called Beth Sarim, which is a Hebrew phrase meaning house of princes. And this mansion is elegant. It's oceanside, so it has a beautiful ocean view. It's just a magnificent property, complete with a convertible V16 Cadillac, which is, I can assure you, just as extraordinary as it sounds. And Rutherford said, well, listen, somebody has to wait here for them to show up, so I'm going to do that. And so Rutherford lived there and wait for the princes, who conveniently never showed up, and Rutherford actually lived there for the rest of his life. And I hope that kind of gives you a taste of the kind of guy that he was. To use the phrase charlatan would not be unkind, because he had a habit of manipulating people and bilking people out of money, consolidating control under himself. The next several leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses, ultimately with the leadership of Nathan Knorr, were a little bit more toned down. Nathan Knorr is a guy who sort of solidified the leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of what is called a governing body. So a group of a number of men, so there was no longer one leader of the organization of the Watchtower Bible Tract Society, but rather it was a body of men, and he sort of modernized the operations of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, they would do things like go around and play sermons at your door on some kind of device. It was under the reign of Nathan Noah where the Jehovah's Witnesses were trained to do door-to-door evangelism and this kind of thing. One of the big things that Nathan Noah did was that he commissioned the writing of the New World Translation, I think at least of the New Testament. I'm not sure if he was the one overseeing the Old Testament. The New World Translation is the Jehovah's Witnesses translation of the Bible. And maybe in the next video we'll get into what the New World Translation has to say, some of its peculiarities. I can assure you it's actually a very fascinating translation of the Bible. It says a lot of very interesting things that we should take a look at. So thank you for watching, and tune in next time when we look at the New World Translation.
Boy, it's dangerous. All saved, all serious. All saved, all serious.
Bad feeling about this.
All saved, all serious. All saved, all saved, all serious. Linked up, 40 deep in the street, you can find us. Yeah, we on theology, but we be on our grind. Yeah, when we were some youngins, only had 2 ways to run. One, become an animal. 2, get out the jungle. So we got our line on a line, bro, this what we do. Run up on you and your crew and tell y'all Jesus is the truth. Open air evangelists, relationships, we do it all. Backpack still full of tracks with a Johnny Mac hat to the back and I back to the wall. Plus I got some homies out there who gon' rep the rock. If you wanna make them stop.